right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a Community Development Exchange, a webinar series with the University of Minnesota Extension Community Development Department. My name is Brandon Hofstad, and I'm the Community Economics Program Leader with the University of Minnesota Extension. And it's my pleasure to kick off today's webinar, Regional Economies in Motion, New Data Tools for Understanding Regional Connections. Before we begin, and as per usual, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. The final video will be posted on our website, and I'll drop that link in the chat here in just a moment so you can have access to it. We also have closed captioning if you need that, and you can enable that at the bottom ribbon on the screen of your Zoom screen and just click the CC. As a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. We will have an opportunity to engage our presenters at the later point in the program. And so you can unmute at that point if you have questions directly for them. If you have questions or comments during their presentation, you can also use the chat function. Again, you can find that at the bottom of your screen, and you can either send it out to the entire group of folks that are on the call, or you can send it out to myself. Again, I should show up at the top of your participant list, Brandon Hofstad, or my colleague, Bridget Tuck, and she should also be show up at the top of the list. So today's webinar includes three presenters, Ben Winchester, Dee Lemire, and Hope Williams. First, Ben is a rural sociologist and evaluation specialist with the University of Minnesota Extension, Department of Community Development, and he conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding the theme of rewriting the rural narrative. Dee Lemire is an extension educator specializing in community economics, agritourism, and sustainable tourism development in rural areas. Dee leverages mobile data and cross-sector partnerships to develop resources and workshops that serve the unique needs of highly seasonal tourism economies. And then finally, we have a special guest from outside the University of Minnesota, community partner Hope Williams. Hope is an economic development director with the city of Detroit Lakes, and previously Hope served as economic director of Economic Alliance serving Wadena County, where she led initiatives on business startups, retention and expansion, community development, community development and regional collaboration. So Hope brings a strong blend of strategic, financial, and community-focused leadership efforts to Detroit Lakes economic development. Together, Ben, Dee, and Hope will explore how combining traditional data with emerging mobile data, for example, Placer.ai, can reveal regional movement patterns and connections using a rural Minnesota case study to show how these insights can strengthen economic development, housing, and workforce strategies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the first presenter, Ben, who will be followed by Hope and Dee. So Ben and team, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brendan. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Ben Winchester, a rural sociologist with Extension. It's really my pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is how we live in the middle of everywhere, is what we call it. And it really gets to the point of like, how are we characterizing how our people live and exist in communities? My own background is looking at rural, and so a part of this kind of narrative we talk about is we're not dying. If our rural communities were dying, then why can't I find a home to buy? So we talk about all these different ways in which we are not dying, and one of those characterizations that we have around the negative narrative is that we live in the middle of nowhere. And while some people are like, want to live in the middle of nowhere. It's not in reality how we actually live. We put our house in the middle of all these different things that we want to look at here. And we'll kind of explore this. And I think this concept first came up literally here at University Extension, we're on the shoulders of giants. And Charles Galpin was a rural sociologist in Western Wisconsin in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. He published a piece, and he was interested in how people defined community. And he didn't always want to bother people. So one of the things that he would do is he would go to the end of people's driveway and see, like, do people like orient themselves more with like Benson or more with, Hancock? So, and he would say, which way did the wagon wheels turn? And this gave him an idea, and he would map this out. He would take a map of the county and map out which ways did the wagon wheels turn. And so he would make these maps around, where do people get their newspapers. He would do follow-up interviews with beyond the wagon wheels, right? Which are unobtrusive, which is great. It's data you can get at exploration of how people are actually living. So he would also map out like where did kids go to high school, where did you bring your milk? And the idea here is that it wasn't always the same place. You connected with one community or one small town for one thing, especially if people lived in the country, and sometimes a small town to the south for other things. So in this way, we started to explore this middle of everywhere concept, and this played into the rural narrative in terms of the brain gain. That is, we've had these people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And when we started to document, like, why are these people moving in and what are they doing and how are they engaging in the broader community, we do know that in general, these newcomers are moving for quality of life. It's immediate access to recreation. There's push and pull factors in here, right? But it's almost all of these pull factors are around like a life-work balance. So on one side, you've got this life-work balance, safety and security, number two. And the third top reason 15 years ago was the low cost of housing. That's not in our top 10 anymore. So when we look at these newcomers moving in, we want to see they're in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. This has been happening since the 70s. And they're not always moving for a job, right? People move in, you can take on a job, you could be telecommuting. The pandemic really accelerated this trend. So when we've done these studies over the years and we ask newcomers, did you move to this small town because you had a job or a job offer in the town? And so a year before the pandemic, 41% of newcomer households said they were moving because they had a job or a job offer. But then this continued to fall. And this has been long-standing under 50% here in Minnesota. But again, during the pandemic now in Montana, we replicated this and found out that number fell even further. Fewer and fewer people now are working in the town that they live in. And now in South Dakota, the latest survey of new rural residents shows that just 1 in 4 newcomer households have a job in that town. So people are telecommuting, they're working in different places around the landscape. So I would hear all the time, like, man, if you got all these new people in town, where are they? They're not in my groups in terms of how people are engaged. And I'd be like, oh, right. There are changes here in nonprofit sector too. And I think there isn't some like old engagement pattern across the communities we have. Many of our nonprofits are new. In fact, more than half of all the nonprofit groups we have in the state of Minnesota have been created in the past 30 years. And the big shift is we have moved away from place-based groups that might have a broad focus. For example, the Community Betterment Club of Hancock. It served everything in Hancock. It helped serve the school or put up the park or the playground, whatever. Didn't matter. It served Hancock. It didn't help Benson right down the road. It just served Hancock, but served everything around it. Today, people want to be involved or engaged in just the opposite on both axes. Rather than a place geography, it's a space geography. So no longer just one place, it's a broad geography in a region. And people aren't involved in just a group that does everything. They're involved in the Snowmobile Association. So the West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association. You got like 3 people in one town and 5 in another. And in totality, you have 140 people. But overall, it's 8 counties to get there. So part of these dynamics around regional living play into these patterns of behavior. We typically use jobs, right? We want to understand this community and this relationship between where people live and work. This tends to be the primary focus of economic development. And again, why would people want to live here unless they had a job? And that may be true 100 years ago, but people are moving in for all of these variety of reasons now. So we have shifted to regional centers, and we have saw big box retailers, for example, shift certain retail segments away from the smaller towns to the regional centers. And we're actually lucky here in Minnesota to have a number of regional centers across the state. And these house jobs, these house people, these house engagement opportunities. We live in these mega regions, is what Dartmouth called it. And when you look at these patterns around these places, it's huge. And we know this already, right? The extent to which you have people coming and going, but we don't think to the extent to which it actually impacts our local planning. So what does this mean then when people are coming and going all the time? Polk County, just 47% of people live and work in the county. Every day, 4,800 people commute from outside the county boundary in. And every day, 7,700 people almost that live in the county are leaving to go work somewhere else. And just 6,700 people both live and work in the county. And this is true in other places too. Hubbard County, both just 37% both live and work, right? So it's not that just even urban centers, everybody is commuting in. You've got people who live in micropolitan areas too that are commuting out to other places. So these dynamics of interaction just are a sprinkle of understanding the complexity of interaction we have around our places. And so we published on this piece. Catherine Lays is an educator in our department out of Southwest, and we wanted to better understand the extent to which people are having this movement across these county boundaries. And we found that today more Minnesotans leave their home county to work than don't. 2018 was the first time more people, we have totally decoupled, not totally, but to a large extent, decoupled home and work. People do not just need a job to move to your town. So what does this really look like? It's a chicken or egg of economic development. Do jobs bring people or do people bring jobs? And it's both. So we live in a regional community in the middle of everywhere. And we put our home in one place, and we used to do this exercise, and we still do to a large extent, but we have and you'll see, there's a much easier way to do this now. But historically in the past, there was an exercise we would do with an extension. So think about this, like I lived in Hancock for a long time. So what you do is you think about a map of your region and then identify, put a star where you live and an X where you work. And right, we'd worked at campus, so my wife and I both commuted all the time. And then draw a boundary now around how far in the past year have you gone to shop and eat out? Right? And like I lived in Hancock and I didn't want to eat at Buddy's Bar and Grill every time we ate out. We had restaurants all over the place. We love them all. Somewhere out in the middle of the country, in between Glenwood and Starbuck on the south side of Minnewaska. Like there's places all over the place. Think about again in the past year, how far have you gone to shop and eat out? But then draw another boundary around how far have you gone to play and recreate? And now we get at this massive number of people going everywhere all the time. And so while the same complexity that you have in your life multiplied by that by the 1,000 people in town or 1,000 people in your county, and you have a massive number of people always coming and going across all of these different places. But we tend to use our place as the winner or the loser. And are we the net gain or how does this work? So for us, the region is the primary unit of interest. And so if you're the mayor and you're like asked by a newcomer, like, hey, I'm thinking about moving to Hancock. And then the mayor's like, oh, you're gonna love Hancock. We got like Buddy's Bar and Grill. We have a C store. We have a full K-12 school. But then I'm like, well, I am looking to Hancock, but I'm also looking to move into Starbuck. And then in our parochialness of this all, the mayor then would be like, you don't want to move to Starbuck. They got nothing going on there. What did you just do then? Like, not only did you downplay Starbuck, you downplayed where you are. You can't name off things around you that I might enjoy doing. Like I really am in the middle of nowhere at this point. So this recognition for me becomes paramount about how the data that we have may limit what we actually see. So one day, Hope Williams, who's here with us today, emailed or called or something with me and said, I just want to know how can we blur the lines? And I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we're talking about. So with that, this is kind of a little setup for Hope and kind of the work that we're doing here today. So I'm going to stop my share and we're going to begin to share with Hope's material and then we'll get into Dee Dee here too. But I just want to say thanks for Hope for asking this question and the implications on the ground of what this means for, not just where you were, but where you are now too. So Hope, hello.
Yes, thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm Hope Williams. I'm the previous executive director of the Economic Alliance, which was Woodinez County's economic development organization. And as an economic developer, it was defined by these our population data, our workforce, our retail, all of it calculated by these boundaries. But in reality, people don't live this way. They cross these lines constantly for work, childcare, healthcare, shopping, and recreation, for all the different reasons. And I started to notice something, probably something you guys all have noticed too. Our decision making was being shaped on local bias. And not in a negative way, but in an extremely human way. Community leaders, boards, and even myself as an economic developer, I was always asking the questions, how does this benefit our city, the community I serve? How does this, land the next business here specifically? How do we grow our tax base? And they're all valid questions, but they also limit how we think. At this time, I was serving for the county, so a broader region than just one city. But I heard these questions all the time in all the communities I served, and one very specific one was, why does everything happen in Wadena? And Wadena was, the county seat, the biggest city in the Wadena County area. And it was a question that always kind of came up when I was working on things. All the businesses are going there, they'd say, or all the housing developments are happening there. So why is this happening? So I reached out to the University of Minnesota Extension at this point because I wanted tools to better answer this bigger question, which was, what does our community actually look like when you remove the lines on a map, and how does that shape how I'd serve as an economic developer? There are a few key challenges that really truly drive this. Local decision making compared to regional reality. We talk a lot about regional collaboration. There's, regional development organizations. These things are already in place, but it's really hard to convince a city council or EDA board to think regionally when all the data in front of them is, it's for their city, it's for their county. How do I look past these lines when nothing helps prove it? Another challenge is competition between neighboring counties or communities, because let's be honest, many of our communities operate as competitors, competing for the same business, workforce, and same grants a lot of the time. And I'll say it plainly. Of course, I want to be the winner. I want to bring the new business in. I want to bring the new housing development in. I want to be the one that helps support the tax base, the growth of the tax base, creating jobs and filling a need that we have locally. That's part of being an economic developer. But what happens when the businesses or the development lands in the community right next to mine, or the county right next to mine? Is it really a loss? Because what you see, we couldn't fully prove, obviously, with how the data has been previously, is if a major employer locates in a neighboring county, my residents probably still might be working there. If retail expands into another community, my residents probably will still shop there. And if tourism increases regionally, my businesses will still benefit. So the question becomes, if I don't land the development, but I'm part of the system that supports it, how do I position my community to benefit from it? Some of the questions that also are these kind of questions came up too, and how do we rate grants? And I mean, have you ever looked at a wonderful grant process and some of the things they ask you for? You're always asked to show regional impact, not just your community, or partner across jurisdictions, or how can you collaborate with other organizations or communities? But without clear data, it's hard to define shared service area, improve cross-community benefit, and justify, there's multiple people getting, positive impact from this. Using mobile data like Placer.ai through the work highlighted in this University of Minnesota Extension research, we were able to look at Wadena County in a completely different way, because my community mindset doesn't match reality. It may be my community because it's the community I serve, but it's not how we live, and it's not how our residents live. The data clearly shows that residents in Wadena County are always traveling outside of county lines, but there's a lot more visitors that were coming into Wadena County than I ever realized. And daily life is just overall regional. We don't live by those boundaries anymore. And Wadena County is not operating as a standalone economy. It's part of a broader region network. But we also see economic activity is, it's shared across communities. We see patterns where workforce flows across multiple county lines. Service like healthcare and amenities are regional. We're going all over the place because we like one over another. And we see where people are coming from, and what time of day they're doing it, and seasonal influence, or, influence movement, and, how retail draw extended beyond those lines. And one thing in Wadena that I always thought was really interesting is we had an authentic German restaurant, and you'd have conversations with people there, and it's, we drove an hour just to eat here. So we're bringing people outside these county lines to, these hubs or these places, or however that might be. And the data created in this moment is, it's big, because it gives us a way to say and show growth in one community is not isolated. It has a ripple effect across the region. So when we can blur the lines between Wadena County and its neighbor counties, we're able to maybe strategically align how we continue to move forward as an economic developer. And that's really where the work that the University of Minnesota Extension did here, and kind of how it comes out. But Dee Dee, I think, is going to jump into how those findings really came. Dee Dee, I'll let you go next here.
Thank you so much, Hope. I so appreciate hearing your perspective. And a big piece of that is because that initial conversation that Ben and I had with you really kind of left us going back to the drawing board and to say, how can we really serve this critical question? Because we saw it as an outgrowth of this body of work that Ben had been doing for some time. And I had been working for several years, to understand how cell phone data and mobile data could be used to potentially understand our work in a new way. And so when we went, to the drawing board, this is something that happens a lot in my work, but often when I'm working with communities, their primary interest is thinking about visitors and like, how do we get more visitors? How do we have them come back? And the literature from community development, community tourism development, and especially rural tourism development is really clear that we need to actually be focusing on a balanced approach between visitors, workforce, and residents. And that we're not, just saying at any cost we want more visitors, because that can cause all kinds of friction and challenges for resident housing, or even simple things like if your workforce can't find a parking spot in order to get to work on time, it can just be this daily friction and challenge between some of these audiences. And so with all the communities that I work with, I'm constantly, thinking about how are we balancing these different groups. Now, when we have a question like what Hope had, the traditional methods that are available for a small community and a rural community and those data points can be really, really limited. And just to give you a sense of Wadena County, because I know we've got a number of people on the call that are from outside of Minnesota, but Wadena County has a RUCS code, the Rural Urban Continuum Code, of a 9. And so that code range goes from a 1 from a highly urban area to a 9 at the far end. So they do not have any urban populations that are above 5,000 people. And so that's for the entire county. When we look at census data, then a lot of those numbers are going to be suppressed because the community sizes are too small. That also flows if we want to request state tax, sales tax data. A lot of that data will be suppressed because communities may only have one grocery store or one hardware store. So we can't look at sales from those categories. They all get lumped together as retail sales. And so there's just a lot of nuance that is really, really limited or lacking when we're working with small communities. The work that I do is predominantly with communities like Wadena County, where there may be a low volume of year-round residents, but many of these communities have very high volumes of seasonal visitors as well. For those of you that don't know, this whole area in north of Wadena County has a huge concentration of lakes. And so there's just a wide variety of recreation activity that happens in this entire region. So we know as either residents or partners with communities like this, that the census data is not the full story for those communities. So beyond, census, there are other kinds of, foundational data sources that we can look to for traditional ways of counting and understanding communities. So certainly, census, we can get some of those broad insights. Lodging tax is another place in Minnesota that we can get some understanding of some movements of people and how much volume we have for visitor traffic, as well as those sales tax receipts. And then, of course, ticket sales, trail counters, intercept surveys, those are all really critical if you're looking to get, a very specific count of a very specific space. But when we're trying to look at something as large as an entire county, there's really no way that you could do an intercept survey for the entire county. There's no way to get at that volume of data unless, you had an unlimited pile of money to send mailed reports and mailed surveys and all of that. So, especially then when we get to those small communities, it can be just extremely, extremely limited. So in my work using mobile data and cell phone data, something that, was just abundantly clear to me with even the first vendor that we worked with is that, it provides a lot of flexibility. And that comes from, the location data that it's generating is based on where your cell phone device moves. So you're not limited by those same jurisdiction boundaries like a county or city kind of boundary. And this data is based on, the location of the device as well. So it's not the address that the cell phone bill is sent to. So if somebody is like a college student, their location is going to be based on where they're in school. It's not based on where their parents are paying the bill. This data provides an estimate of visits. It's not as exact as if you were, standing and counting heads or taking tickets at an event, but it really does help us to get at some stronger counts and more detail. And then it also does not include minors or, if a visitor did not have a mobile device. And I should also say that it does not include international visitors as well. So, it's not perfect data, but it definitely gives us a level of detail that would not otherwise be available to a rural community like Wadena. So, if you're not familiar with mobile data, I think a really important distinction to make is really like what we're counting and what these numbers mean. So there are two primary ways that numbers are represented in the mobile data information. And the one is with visit counts. And so that's kind of thinking about, different stops or the kinds of activity that an individual may be making throughout a community. So I love the examples that I've seen in the chat about people's movements today, but just thinking, personally that, I left my home, I drove 70 miles to my office, so that becomes a visit. If I stop for lunch or go out for coffee, that kind of things, those each become a visit. That's in contrast, though, to a visitor count. And so even though a visitor may make multiple stops and have multiple visits, we're still only talking about one individual. So with this data as well, something that I really appreciate about it is that it's not identifiable from our work. And so we don't have any device, information. That's all protected. And so what we're able to access is information where 50 or more visitors have been. And so it gives us kind of this level of flexibility where we can, answer questions like hopes, but we're also not too bogged down by really getting into the weeds of dealing with all of the individual device codes and that kind of information. So what this all means, here's an example. Currently, the software provider that we're using is Placer.ai. There are a whole variety of vendors that are available. We used a previous vendor as well, and this one has been helpful because of some of these different visuals. So I love this visual because when I share this with communities, it's like they'll have just this reaction of like, oh, that's us. They can see it. Even if as a researcher or from outside of the community, it can be that kind of like, what are we looking at exactly? What does this mean? So let me just kind of show you. So this orange kind of big spike those are the visitors and those visitor counts throughout the year. And for the purpose of this particular research study that we did with Wadena, this is for the entire year of 2024. I can go back currently as far back as 2019, and there's a relatively short delay on this data. It usually seems to be about 2 weeks or so that I can get this kind of data. So we don't have the same kind of turnaround time as the census piece. But so this is looking at visitors that are coming from outside of the county. Second line, this green line, are residents. And so those are much more stable across the year. There is some variability. And what I really notice is, when we think about community development work, especially, is just thinking about what is that experience for residents throughout the year. And so here in January, if you are not familiar, it can be pretty cold in Minnesota. And it changes, people's visitor patterns. So if, somebody's in Wadena County and stops at a coffee shop in January, the likelihood, that they're going to be able to bump into a fellow resident is higher, that the people that are in that space are more likely to be residents because there are many, many fewer visitors. But if you look, at some of those summer Saturdays where there's higher peaks, it may be harder for residents to actually, identify like who is a neighbor, who's somebody that lives there, versus, the just sheer volume of visitors that may be present at that time. And then the last line there on the bottom, those are the commuters into the community. And so these have kind of a plateau shape where there's, a lot of that visitor traffic is happening Monday through Friday, and then it drops off a little bit over the weekends. I'm sorry, the commuter traffic. But you'll notice for any one of these different categories, it never goes down to zero. You always have people in each category in the county. So there isn't a universal experience of visiting or moving through the community, that there's a variety of activities, a variety of experiences happening all the time. The other piece then that has happened when I've shared this with folks in Wadena, it's not just saying like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because communities will actually identify what those peaks are. And so in this case, when I, chatted with some folks from Wadena, they looked at it and said, oh my gosh, that's the Nimrod Bull Bash event that happens over Labor Day weekend. And that's deer hunting opener. And they just can look at that and identify it and see it as like, oh, that makes sense for our community. And that's a pretty stark contrast to other forms of data and the census data and things that we have available. To be able to have communities look at that and say, oh, that's us. Yes, that's true. It provides a very different starting point for those community development kinds of conversations, and to be able to say, okay, what kinds of needs do we have? How are we making those planning decisions to accommodate our actual reality? So to dig into this a little bit further, I think it's helpful to kind of pull apart those different groups. And so when I'm looking at, workforce from this data in particular, we can, as Ben mentioned, we can look at the census data, and this is based on the map tool that's available through the census, and where you can see that from that data based on 2022 census information, it shows that a little over 3,100 commuters come into Wadena for work, 2,400 live and work in Wadena, and then 3,300 leave the county for work. And so what this data is, saying from the census is actually that Wadena exports more workforce than they bring in daily. And through doing this project, and working to address Hope's question, something that, we found is that it actually looked pretty different than that. And so using cell phone data, we don't have that same kind of delay as with the census. But what we're able to see is that there very likely are more employees or that the census is likely undercounting the number of employees in Wadena County. And so this is one that I wanted to pull up as well, just to kind of give you another sense. We can even go a little bit further into that commuter data. And so that upper line where it's at about 3,500, those are resident employees in that workforce. And then you have the inbound commuters where that ranges anywhere from 500 to 1,500 pretty regularly. So you have a whole variety of ways using these kinds of tools that you can really dig into what's happening with your workforce and what kinds of patterns and things that you see. And I appreciate, what you had said, Hope, of just that question of, that it's not just what's happening within your county, but that, if businesses are built, and new employers come in that are adjacent to your county, that you can still win. So this is a way that we can actually start to measure that or explore that further with communities. One thing of note for Wadena in particular is that it showed that over the 4th of July was actually like the lowest employee count in the area. And that's pretty different than some other, I can kind of move that so you can see a little bit more, but from some other tourism kinds of areas. So it may show that the kinds of tourism that's happening may be more heavy into the fall for this particular region. Another way of thinking or looking at the workforce for Wadena County was actually to map it out, and where you can see here just the huge range that people are coming from in order to work in the area. And I thought one of the pieces that was really interesting was Hope had actually shared with us a story of hearing about some nurses that were having to commute very long distances because they weren't able to find housing in the community. So this may include, seasonal, I'm sorry, not seasonal, professionals that work part-time in the county. It's very common in rural areas to have, say, like specialty healthcare providers that they may work 1 day a week at one particular clinic, but their base may be in a metro area in another place. And so that's the kind of difference that I think we're seeing with this, where the census would say that their employment of record may be, say, in Fargo, but they may be spending a full day in Wadena County on a regular basis, so they're showing up as an employee in the area. That's the kind of information then when, someone like Hope is trying to figure out, what kinds of restaurants and amenities and things do we need? If we're able to actually understand our real workforce and those kinds of behaviors, that can really help to have a fuller picture of what needs exist. Another big piece that came out of this collaboration is that from the mobile data information, I'm able to actually export the location of those employees, their home location by zip code. And, in tourism research, we commonly use a 50-mile radius as kind of the line of demarcation between a day visitor or an overnight visitor. And what this information allowed us to do is to actually like go through and to look at those zip codes and to catalog and categorize them by which ones should be considered local to the community that would fall close to, within that 50-mile range, and then what zip codes should be considered regional. And so with Hope's help, we were able to actually have that be a more customized process that made sense for this community. And, especially in a rural area, just the access alone to, say, an interstate highway, like the southern end of Wadena County has more interstate and highway access than the northern end, that can really change what should be considered, regional or local. So we were able to develop a more refined research process with this. It's no surprise then, a lot of those employees are coming from a local area. Just shy of 60% are coming from the 7 local zip codes that we identified. And then another almost 29% are coming from regional zip codes. So about in a 50-mile kind of radius. It is notable, though, that 9% came from outside of that regional area within the state of Minnesota, and almost 2% came from out of state as well. So if we look at residents in contrast, again, I can do the same kind of thing and to say, hey, where are those residents going when they're working? There's a smaller concentration of where they're headed, but we can still see that residents are ending up all over into the western ends of Wisconsin and North Dakota, as well as the far northern reaches of Minnesota and into southern Minnesota as well. So those residents, aren't just crossing a county boundary, but they may be traveling across state lines, which I think can be a surprise when you're looking at a county that's almost in like central Minnesota, that there would be such a huge stretch and reach. There was a very similar pattern overall that most of the residents that are working outside of the county are still within that local or regional range. Um, and there's a small portion that are out of state at 1.6%, and about 8% are outside of that 50-mile range in the state. So most are definitely, served in that local or regional setting. And I think that this is a great connection to what Hope was saying about that desire to look at, those regional impacts, but we can actually start to track some of that or measure it over time, depending on needs. The other piece that I'm able to look at are some of the, to build on Ben's work of having people, actually draw their circles themselves, but where I can actually look at where they're going for different kinds of activities. And so this is in our report, and it goes into more detail, but where we can actually look at, the top 50 different locations that residents are going to. And again, it very much shows that, in purple, those are the county lines for Wadena County, but people are going quite a ways away in order to access the activities that they're looking for. And I can, using the software, you can actually like change the different categories and whatnot that you're looking for as well. And so when we look at these different topics and whatnot, we're able to see how it shifts a little bit where people are going, those top 50 different visits and locations. And then I have one more here for you as well. So there's a whole variety of ways that people's patterns shift depending on what we're looking at. And there are a number of other, possible categories we can choose from as well. But this is really just designed to mirror, some of the work that Ben's been doing about where people shop and recreate over time. And as I mentioned, on the southern end of the county there's the State Highway 10 there, but you can kind of see it almost dotted along there. So, that access through highways is really critical in order to be able to get to the services that people want. So I'll pass that over to you, Hope.
Yeah, so I think after looking over the data, and if you have not read the whole report, definitely recommend doing that. But kind of the question is, what are our next steps with this information and how to continue to use it moving forward? On this specific data set, I have since transitioned out of Wadena County, and I'm now serving as the Economic Development Director for the City of Detroit Lakes. But I am excited to share that they have hired to fill my previous position with Wadena County, and I'm excited to see how this transition and this data continues to shape the county's strategic future, because you can definitely continue to utilize it as, an overall, whether it's a strategic plan or comprehensive plan, how to continue to move your communities forward. The data can help shape that, raise questions, some of the focus areas maybe you need to do. And I do really want to also put out there, I've been reading some of the questions, Placer.ai specifically, if you haven't demoed with them, I'm sure it'd be a great opportunity for you. There are other mobile data tracking companies you can utilize. It's really interesting to see kind of how in depth you can go. This research specifically was very focused in, at looking at it as a community economic developer. But there are so many other ways out than just that specific information. I mean, you can use it for site selection, trying to, kind of sell, different businesses to potentially come into your community. I mean, there's so many different ways to use it. I mean, even like a really good example I think I've seen in other communities is, a music festival. How many people are coming in for that reason, and how many different businesses, restaurants, all the different things are getting additional revenue sales because of this one event. It's a very great tourism data set as well. So I recommend looking into it. Definitely read the report if you haven't, that the University of Minnesota put out. But kind of diving into what are those next steps, Wadena County specific, I think they'll continue to, use it and, strategically align with it. But I think it's, overall as economic developers, community developers, we need to think beyond just who lives where we're serving and start thinking about who is here, when, and why. And kind of that's where this data becomes really powerful if you're able to get it for your own community. It gives us a way to reframe conversations with our local leaders, and it allows us to have more productive conversations like if that business locates in our neighboring county, how do we align our housing strategy, childcare services to make sure that we can support that workforce and still have an economic boost because of it. And this really changed, kind of how I see success as an economic developer, especially in such a rural community like that. Um, because landing a business in your community is a win. Obviously, we want to see it. But so is a neighbor county landing a major employer where, your community provides housing for that workforce, or your businesses capture some of that spending and infrastructure supporting regional movement. I mean, that's still economic impact, that's still growth. And in many cases, it's more realistic and an achievable strategy. Now, this data can be a really big game changer for grants as well, because we also now have, true service areas based on movement and not just based off the boundaries that were designed years ago. It shares, how multiple counties, communities, cities can work together and build a stronger regional partnership backed by real data. And, grant administrators really do like to see that. And instead of competing for funding, we can maybe start asking, how do we package this as a regional project that benefits multiple communities and it becomes stronger because of it. And I've thought about this too in, housing developments. If you're going to bring a housing developer into your community, especially a small rural community where, 5,000 or less, can you come do 20 twin homes in 1, 2, 3 communities right next to each other? And, how can you partner together doing that? But for me, the work really comes down to one core idea. Um, County and city lines were created years ago. They were created before I think we even had access to vehicles, but we don't live our lives like this anymore. But something I'd really also like to note in the work we do as an economic developer, community developer, and many of you guys probably have experienced this, but the geographic boundaries like a city or county lines do matter to us in some aspects still, of course. They define how we operate, how we're funded, and how decisions are made. And ultimately, the communities we're responsible for serving or, providing our services to. And at the same time, those boundaries are not how our residents live their daily lives. And it's definitely not how the economy truly functions. People regularly are crossing those lines for employment, childcare, and all the fun things. But we can really start looking at, where the opportunity is when we bridge these two perspectives. Historically, many of us have been conditioned to operate with our boundaries, often putting 100% of our focus and success metrics into, strictly with what those lines looked like. And the approach is understandable, especially when outcomes like tax-based growth, job creation, and development activity are measured by those boundaries. But we're really able to look at it as a more regional standpoint. It can lead to, competition instead of collaboration. We don't want to see those things. It can really narrow how we define success. And I think, with this work, the use of mobile data, it can really help demonstrate, how we maintain our local focus while expanding how we think. By blurring the lines and how we interpret data, we gain a clear understanding of how people actually move, the residents we are serving, and where economic activity actually occurs, and how communities are interconnected. And that insight allows us to make more strategic direction, or give us more strategic direction within the boundaries. And what I'd really like to encourage a lot of you, economic community developers, community leaders, even if your community feels like you're facing similar challenges, I'd really ask, are strategies based on people actually move, or just the boundary lines, or just where they live? Or are you competing with your neighbors, and how could you align with them instead? And are you missing opportunities because your data is just too narrow? I mean, you think how often we move. I mean, I use myself as an example. When I was working for Medina County, I lived in Otter Tail County, and I probably visited at least 5 counties a month to do, no, not even a month, probably a week to do my shopping for recreation. I was going all over the place, and that's how our residents are moving, and that's how our economy is calculated too. So because in this experience and what we saw in Medina County, the story of your community is so much larger than your boundaries, because what our community is our residents. And ultimately, this is not about minimizing the impact of local economic development. It's really about enhancing it. We still serve our geographic bounds, but we're still accountable for our communities. But by better understanding the regional system, our communities are even a part of, we can really make more informed local decisions, identify opportunities we would have otherwise missed, build stronger partnerships, and deliver more meaningful, sustainable outcomes. And at the end of the day, city-county lines will continue to shape how we operate, but they do not define how our communities function. If we can align strategically more closely with that reality, we position ourselves in the communities we serve for greater long-term success. So I think that's really, as an economic economic developer, I'd love to see this data for my new community that I'm serving, and kind of looking at, how we continue to move forward in a stronger perspective and more strategic direction when we're using this stuff like mobile data. Because I mean, when we look at the world, mobile data and technology overall is going to continue to advance and shape some of our future decision making. But at that, I think I'm going to leave that at kind of what next steps are. I'm excited to see what Medina County continues to move forward with it. But I think we're going to open it up for questions here.
Great. And thank you, Hope, Dee Dee, and Ben. And I will spotlight each one of them. This is an opportunity for question and answer. And so for those of you who feel comfortable, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand and I will call on you. But to get us started, Dee Dee, I'm going to do some rapid succession questions that probably can have quick responses. And Bridget did respond to some of them, but just so folks can see it. So the first question is information aggregated in county, or can there be smaller scale to identify specific areas?
Yes, absolutely. There can be smaller scale. This was one of the first times we were actually able to use county-wide data, which was really great timing. And to before we were actually in many ways more limited by being kind of capped on how large of a geographic area we could go to. And so having the county level data was, really helpful for working with Hope, when her role and that question was at that county-wide level. But I have run a whole variety of reports, including, as small as working with individual farms for an agritourism project, where it's, one specific business that's in a very rural area and being able to kind of zero in on some of their visitor information as part of another study that I did. So there's a wide range of sizes that we're able to access. We are limited because we have to have at least 50 different visitors to a space. And then there's also some constraints as well. So I can't, with this particular platform, we can't run reports on sensitive locations, such as religious buildings, places where children are typically at, like playgrounds, schools, etc. And there's some other categories as well.
Wonderful. And I think the other questions, you sort of alluded to the other one about, whether the phone is turned off and then sensitive information. So there were some questions and you can respond to those in the chat.
Yeah.
So earlier in the presentation, Inder had asked, could you provide some examples of how Placer.ai data was used to look up regional economic activity, and understands that you can track commuter patterns, but wants to understand how you can translate that into economic and growth outcomes regionally?
So I think that was a little bit outside of the scope of what we were looking to do for this particular project. Placer, as one example of this kind of software, was designed originally for use with real estate development. And so I think that's part of why it's become popular with some economic development professionals, as they've been able to see where, there may be some application to looking at a particular plot of land and helping put together a pitch for working with a business on that. But in our work in community development, that's really outside of the scope of what we do. Our unit of measure is the community level and looking at that community level impact. So those kinds of specific development questions would be left more to that professional team within that community. But and when we did this study as well, we're still really learning that, the platform wasn't built for community development. There isn't one, yet for community development. And so we're constantly working on how are we testing the data, making sure that it's accurate, but then also understanding the application at the community level. So this was really a test to be able to start to explore building out that kind of feasibility.
Right. I'd like to mention too, I mean, there are a lot of different ways you can utilize mobile data tracking like Placer.ai. And I'd say it would definitely be more up to, the economic developer, community developer themselves on how they would like to utilize it. Obviously for the U of M extension piece, for the meanings of reports and how that looks. I think the data really shows really exciting information for the county we did it for. But if you were interested in, getting it for your own community and utilizing it, they actually have a lot of really good resources and a training team on staff that, if you're looking at it more as an economic development standpoint, that you're able to be like, hey, I'd like to, be able to potentially bring in this business. How can we kind of run that data? And they really do help you with through that too as well, and how to calculate it. And it's really useful for your current businesses, trying to bring in businesses, kind of how your residents do move, operate, and some of like the type of businesses they're going to. Can it community support another one similar to it? So there's definitely a lot of great ways to utilize it. Mobile data tracking, I think, is kind of a little bit of a newer concept, especially on a local level. But definitely something to look into. And if you're interested, you can definitely reach out to Placer.ai as well to get that demo and see kind of what the resources they have available too.
Wonderful. And I think we probably have time for one more question, and then I'm going to turn it to Ben. So if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question directly of our presenters, please feel free to do so. Sounds like we may not have anybody who wants to unmute and put themselves on the mic. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben for a closing comment.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everybody. Really, thank you for being here today. I just want to reiterate that, modern economies require modern ways to look at them. So, like modern tools and modern challenges require these modern tools. So, this is all very new, and it's really not as simple as just asking the same questions we asked before. Like, this provides a new avenue to explore this interaction between your residents and your visitors. And so, for me, I just want to advocate for any chance you get to educate your industry around what this tool is. So, like, we could stay busy doing a report for all these communities, but right now we've got a lot of economic and community developers across the state and across the nation that are just learning how to use this too. And there's nuances to the caveats of what it is and what it isn't. And so we could actually start a whole cohort around this type of thing. But ideally, just so you know, this is all very new. And ideally, to use this to explore not just what's happening today, but how you change over time, which you can do with this data really easily. So I just want to say thank you for being here and being open to this kind of new modern economic development strategy tool that we've got before us. And kick it back to you, Brandon. Thanks.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much. Hope, I want to say thank you for taking the time. She joined us on vacation, so that's even more impressive, as well as being a partner. So we really appreciate that. And thank you, Dee Dee and Ben, for taking the time to share. For those that are interested, you can reach out, as it was in the chat. Bridget had dropped in a link to regional educators located across the state. But we also, please feel free to reach out to myself, Ben, or Dee Dee, or Bridget if you have further questions, and we would be happy to work with you and to direct you in a direction that could be helpful. So again, thank you all for joining. A follow-up email will be coming probably within a week, as soon as we can get it up and ready on our website with materials and so forth. You'll be able to find it here, but if you registered for this, you'll also find a follow-up email. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.